gotta get out of there right now!
Alright, let me grab my...
This latest craze of releasing updates to existing titles continues unabated. Now it's Capcom's turn to throw their hats into the ring with updates to their existing titles on the Series X, the Series S and the PlayStation 5, offering high frame rate modes and ray tracing. So is this one patch to rule them all, or are some more equal than others? Capcom have been at this video game malarkey for a very long time, and for a good portion of that, the Resident Evil series has been a jewel in their portfolio. The RE engine really smashed into the last generation and is a standout engine across all versions and all formats. But here the updates offered are basically a backport from what we saw in Resident Evil Village. The ray tracing options in there have now been pushed back into this third person and first person titles in Resident Evil 7. And fundamentally, it's the same options for all three titles. That means that on the Series S, the Series X and the PlayStation 5, you now have three modes. Ray tracing, a high frame rate mode, or a standard mode, which is per se the original mode you saw on last generation consoles, albeit at a higher resolution and potentially frame rate performance level. This means that you can choose between the two modes, 4K or 120 FPS and a low resolution for the Series S. You do have to restart the renderer though to turn ray tracing on and off. So let's start with the oldest of the lot, Resident Evil 7. This 2017 title is obviously going to struggle to backport ray tracing into an engine so old, and that means we may see some issues. And we do. The first is the mixed results of the ray tracing reflections. Due to the material surface reflectance, effectively the BRDFs and diffuse levels, the outcome is we can see less reflections than SSR solution offers, and on some areas too many reflections, and this can change the look of some scenes and objects. The standout issue though is the post-processing TAA now smears the relatively lower resolution reflections that RT offers, which can look like a retro 16-bit texture at times. Now screen space reflections is already quite dithered and can break down under movement. However, these ray tracing additions can be worse as that TAA pass now includes all local pixels data with no depth or clamping used. Again, this is an issue due to the age of the core game rendering and material code requiring more time to integrate and update. This ghost white water surface is a good example of what I mean, leaving reflections looking like smoke and losing the water's diffuse base albedo. It's not all bad though. The global illumination can improve light bounce into darker areas, along with improving metallic objects and even creating darker areas by reducing light leak and fake game-like glow. Results can be good to invisible without this kind of side-to-side analysis. All three offer the same levels of ray tracing aside resolution reductions on the Series S, and this affects all resolution elements such as shadow reflections, etc. All modes on Series S run at 1440p and all modes run at 2160p on Series X and PlayStation 5. The image is very noisy and dithered due to the lower buffers used, specifically those alpha and post effects. But due to the doubling of that resolution pixel output on the Series X and PlayStation 5, the Series S is the noisier of the lot. But due to the chromatic aberration, film grain all adding to that David Fincher lost VHS style, it doesn't make that much of a difference. Beyond this, the other two modes lose ray tracing effects but now mirror last generation versions, albeit at higher resolutions, and that high frame rate target is exactly the same as that except at 120 FPS, and this means performance is a bit of a mixture across the modes. So starting with the PlayStation 5 first, there really is the two new modes to cover. The ray tracing mode, which targets 60 FPS at 4K, and the 120 FPS mode, which also targets 4K. These are really where the performance issues may crop up, and what we see is we get zero issues in the ray tracing mode, fully locked in identical sections here, and practically identical in that 120 FPS mode. This is in all tested sections. It can dip occasionally into the next refresh cycle of basically 16.6 milliseconds, but you wouldn't feel that in most 120 FPS titles because it's very infrequent and it's just too fast a frame rate. They're too close together. You can obviously enable VRR if you want to get the fastest refresh refresh possible, but it doesn't make that much of a difference on all formats. They all support it, Series X, Series S and PlayStation 5, so you can enable it just like you can in Resident Evil Village if you so wish, but performance is pretty much a lock across all versions here. And then this is exactly the same story we see on the Series X. Now, in the most stressful section I can find in the middle of the mansion, walking around this lobby section, you could see a couple of dips, again down to around the 115 FPS on the Series X in that 120 FPS mode, and again in battling with heavy alpha effects swamping the screen, and that's identical as it is on the PS5 if you test it. It's very, very infrequent, never goes above the next refresh cycle, and it's so minor as it's effectively a locked 120 FPS in this mode. And it really is the mode that I would choose across both the PS5 and the Series X, because you don't notice the ray tracing benefits, even though they are nice that they've added them in, and it's a great option. If you have a 120 FPS screen, turn this mode on, get the faster response time from your controller, the fastest refresh rate, and never look back. It's the best way to enjoy and play this older title. Now, the Series S is very close. In the normal mode at least, it's completely locked, just like it is on all of the versions, due to the headroom available in that 120 FPS mode. We know that it's not going to dip below 60 because it's the same version effectively, it's just uncapped the frame rate. This means in the standard mode, it's the one to choose if you don't have a 120 FPS screen, because it never drops a frame in all my tested sections, and it performs perfectly in heavy battles, exploring the mansion, no issues at all. But if you flick to the ray tracing mode or the 120 FPS mode, then you do see far more dips than we see on the Series X and PlayStation 5, which are effectively locked. This means the 120 FPS mode can spend time somewhere between the 90s and the 100s. It can feel very smooth and consistent most of the time. Do not get me wrong, it doesn't feel bad. And again, most of the skips are into that next refresh cycle. So VRR would help alleviate some of the issues if it can maintain a frame rate somewhere in between that 8 millisecond gap between the two. But the 60 FPS ray tracing mode can also have some dips, which means even though it's nice to have as an option here, some people may find that worse, and the newer the engine becomes and the more stressful it becomes, we will discuss how bad that can get in later releases. But certainly in Resident Evil 7, it's good enough that you could still turn it on and appreciate that 60 FPS ray tracing option, and the 120 FPS mode is the one I would choose. It does feel more consistent and responsive on a 120 FPS screen. So Resident Evil 7 is a pretty decent update across the board. The Series S comes out worst of the lot, but not by a huge margin. Lower resolutions and slightly worse performance, but still very impressive updates for a title as old as Resident Evil 7. So next we have one of the best remakes ever made, capturing the essence of the original yet modernising and revitalising it for new and old players alike. This was planned to have ray tracing at launch, but slipped until this patch. As Resident Evil 7, we see GI and reflections added into the post-effect suite. Although, because this title did intend to have ray tracing as part of its development cycle, this one definitely benefits more from those reflections, and they are better implemented, specifically with the TAA, and they do improve the visual quality across many material surfaces. There's lots of water reflections, metallic objects, and again that dithered, diffuse, much lower resolution the ray tracing reflections use does stand out at certain points, but they are much better than the SSR reflections in the base title. You can see examples here that dithered, draw out issues that SSR always present. They're now significantly resolved here, and the TAA is better implemented. There are some subtle changes to where SSR did and didn't work before, and material quality, like I say, has obviously affected that, and some tone mapping shifts, but generally it's an improved visual quality, and all those elements I covered in Resident Evil 7 are all here, but they work much better. And just like that, resolution and effect parity is kept between PS5 and Series X, and only resolution differences reduce on Series S, meaning ray tracing on and off still targets 2160p on the Series X and PS5. It now targets 1440p still on the Series S, but once you move over to the high frame rate mode, there are some bigger sacrifices. This means we now see a 10% reduction in that resolution on the top-end consoles, dropping slightly from that 2160p level, and it means we see even further reductions on the Series S, now dropping to 2240 by 1260. Now, this isn't a huge delta, but it does mean that all resolution effects and image quality can be a little bit more unstable. In addition to this, it also disables per object and camera motion blur across all versions, but at 120 FPS that's hard to spot, and ambient occlusion is also turned off. This means that you gain a little bit more performance back from this, which helps the performance levels that 120 FPS needs. And this version of the engine, as I mentioned before, is more demanding, so we do see worse performance in most modes that target above the standard. Ray tracing and effects are a match across all versions, including those limited surface that it can actually sample. Some of them still fall back to projected cube maps, but performance is where the differences really stand out the most.
You alright?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
You can thank me later, when we're safe.
In a similar setup to what we saw on the base PS4 and Xbox versions, performance in cutscenes is slightly better on the Series X over PS5, to the tune of around 7%, and then gameplay in ray tracing mode at least is around 7% better on the PS5 on average. Basically invisible on both. You'd never spot it without this kind of analysis, but unlike Resident Evil 7, where it's pretty much a locked 60 throughout all my tested sections, here we are generally sub 60 FPS most of the time, and in some of the cutscenes it can drop down to the high 30s. In addition to this, the series consoles have longer hangs of 150 milliseconds between cuts and cinematics, which the PlayStation 5 doesn't have due to data throughput that ray tracing requires. Now, this means that a 30 FPS option in the menu would be my preferred choice. Turn it on, and then those that don't have a VRR screen can just enjoy a more consistent frame rate. It's certainly very good at 60 to be there, and I agree it should be in the option. VRR can help and significantly reduce a lot of the dips because it hangs somewhere between the high 40s and low 50s. But generally, a 30 FPS cap would be a great option. This means that it can feel the most inconsistent of the lot, but it certainly is a choice much better than what we see on the Series S, because this significantly drops below 60. Well, basically it's a 30 FPS title. It doesn't hit 60 at any tested section, and predominantly it's in the 30s and can actually just dip below 30 on occasional sections. All the same reasons, reductions as mentioned on resolution, it certainly would require a 30 FPS cap to feel consistent, but again it's great that Capcom are pushing the machine so hard with the limitation they've got here. Certainly bandwidth and pixel fill rate and memory are all the three main areas that are impacting this console and will continue to do so throughout the generation. The 120 FPS mode again does very well. Reductions as mentioned certainly help out a lot, but it does sometimes 3 times the amount of performance compared to the ray tracing, just showing you how demanding that ray tracing option is within the menu, and it's certainly again the version I would choose. The non-ray trace mode can almost hold a 60 FPS lock, but there are a couple of dips I noted throughout testing, but it's very, very minor. 120 FPS would be the best mode to play this on the Series S, and again, it would likely be the best mode to play on the PS5 and Series X because it feels the most consistent. Yes, generally it can be at points 70 FPS at the worst case across all 3 consoles, and again, in the similar situations, it flip-flops between 7 or 8% between the PS5 and Series X, depending on cutscene and gameplay. This means that performance-wise, the 120 FPS mode wins out, with generally the performance being very close to identical on both of them. Again, cutscenes, cinematics, they flip-flop a little bit. It's very hard to get identical sections, but generally cutscenes are slightly better on the Series X than they are on the PS5 to a few percent, and the other way around for gameplay. Predominantly, that is again the option I would choose if you have it. If not, then the 60 FPS non-ray trace mode is locked, smooth as silk, no issues at all. And generally, this is the most impressive of all 3 titles in the collection because it's an absolutely cracking update, and it is one of my favourite titles of the last generation.
Bastard.
And we come to the final of the trio, and it sits somewhere between 7 and the 2 Remake. With it being a spur of RE development in parallel with 2 Remake, it does have the most accomplished ray tracing, as it was a year later in development. Vertical planar reflections now use ray tracing, as do semi-transparency, brush metals, water surfaces. All of these look very, very good, with again the S being the lowest resolution of the lot, not by a huge margin, but it now keeps all modes at the same 1260 we saw in the high frame rate mode in Resident Evil 2, but the Series X and PlayStation 5 all tie at the same 2160 in all 3 modes. This means that the same updates to GI, lighting and reflections are the same and consistent across the board, with the S having the lowest quality of the lot. But it doesn't really use GI as often, or at least it doesn't stand out in the material sections as much as it does in Resident Evil 2. So the performance then for the Series S in that 120 FPS mode, it does a pretty similar job to what we saw in Resident Evil 2. It certainly can fluctuate between the low 70s to 120 FPS, and it's certainly good enough to be a mode here that if you turn it on, you would definitely feel the most responsive and smoothest gameplay. Like I say, the resolution levels, because they don't fluctuate, you get used to all three of them, so you're not really losing out as much there. But there is definitely a much softer image here compared to all the other games. It stands out between the PS5, the Series X, and the Series S. You can definitely see it's close to 1080p. Effectively, the performance, though, is pretty good. I'm sure if you had VRR and you turn this on, you'd never look back. And it's the smoothest way to play the title, aside that standard non-ray trace mode, which is a lock 60 across all of them. Again, that 120 FPS mode is pretty much the same. So this is why we know that it won't drop any frames. Even though I've tested it, it's the same. So moving away from that, the ray trace mode is, again, slightly worse than what we saw in Resident Evil 2. It again, can have a similar issue, but it's a couple of frames on average worse across all three consoles than it is in Resident Evil 2, and it's not because it's more demanding, it's slightly less demanding because of the lack of, dismemberment, all those elements in the engine, but it still performs slightly worse, and it can perform slightly worse on the PS5 this time than the Series X in both gameplay and cinematics, or at least the tested sections we see. Not a huge amount, talking on 4% maybe frame rate on average. It comes out 4.5% between the two, and this is consistent in both the ray trace mode and the 120 FPS mode, and again it's about 3 or 4% worse on the Series S over the PlayStation 5. Not a huge margin, but certainly in this kind of comparison, something to make note of. It's consistently a 30 FPS title again on Series S, and it's close to that on Series X and PS5. An option to cap to 30 would fix it. It can fluctuate in and out of that VRR range, so that won't really fix this option, but you can turn it on. It will maybe reduce some of the issues that crop up, but in most action sections, it can be somewhere around that mid 40s, high 30s. That's kind of where it tends to sit. And that means that the 120 FPS mode is the one I'd choose. Still, even though the ray tracing options and reflections are the best of the lot, they're not consistently across the title, and therefore, for me, it's not worth the cost. I would turn it on, get the improved frame rate, the improved performance and input times, and just make the game more enjoyable. In addition to this, all three versions load the game incredibly fast now. We're talking sub 2-second loading on PS5 and just over 2 seconds on the Series X and Series S. So somewhere between 50 to 100% improvement on the PS5, but when you're talking about 1 second to 2 seconds, it's almost instantaneous. No one's really going to notice it. And again, these consistently across all three titles. So it's definitely a nice free boost that allows you to enjoy these cracking titles one more time, or if not, dive back in and pick them up. They are brilliant, and these updates from the RE engine really help improve what is already a great series of titles. And that's another autopsy complete on video game technology, graphics, performance, and all things engine related. If you like what we do here, then keep it IGN, and there'll be more performance reviews coming soon. But for now, I'm out, but I'll catch you on the next one.